Tensta Museum is a project where a small art center pretended to be a museum talking about the area where the art center is located. The location for this is in Stockholm, in the outskirts, in the suburb of Tensta, and the art center is called Tensta Konsthall, a private foundation that has existed since 1998, when it was started by an artist who lived in the neighborhood and his friends who felt that it was important to have contemporary art activities there. They located a space in the basement of a modest shopping mall around 400 square meters, and this is what it looks like when it is empty. And it is basically underneath this part of Tensta, just as you exit the subway. It takes about 20 minutes on the subway from the city center to Tensta. From above, it looks like this on the right-hand side. It's a late modernist housing estate that was built between 1967 and 1972 as part of a nationwide housing scheme designed in order to provide better housing for the inhabitants of Sweden. Sweden had very poor housing conditions up until the early 60s. So this big scheme, the Million Dwelling Program, did raise the conditions in one go with 1 million housing units built during a 10-year period. Tensta is the single biggest housing estate within this Million Dwelling Program. Today, 20,000 people live in Tensta. 90% of them have a trans-local background. This means a lot of people with a background in the Middle East, in East Africa. And basically, you can trace world politics and events in the world in relation to the inhabitants of the area, because wherever there is an influx of migrants, they tend to come to Tensta. On the left-hand side, you see a green area. This is a natural reserve, the Järva field, and I will return to that a little bit later. It's not virgin ground at all, although the housing area is from the late 60s. In fact, the oldest building in the whole of Stockholm is located in the middle of Tensta. It's the Spånga Church with parts from the early 12th century. This means that the church is older than any part of the old town in Stockholm, which is the historical center of the capital of Sweden. Even the Vikings were in Tensta about 1,000 years ago and left a couple of rune stones. This one is sitting right outside the church. And back to Tensta Konsthall. But the mission is also to relate to the area, to the inhabitants of the area, people working in the area. And the cafe, which we started when I came there in 2011, became a focal point for people who just want to have coffee or meet up with friends, or who are there before or after seeing an exhibition or particular event. It was, during my time, run by a family living in Tensta with a background in Ethiopia, and hence the food was delicious. And the vegan lunches that my colleague Asrin Haidari initiated, that happened one Sunday every month, attracted people from all over Stockholm. And the team running this place was really small, between 5 and 10 people during my 8 years there. And this also talks about the brittleness, the fragility of the art institution, a really small structure with a slim budget and a small but very dedicated and fantastic team. So many other things. And here is which was a way for us to get to know the neighborhood. We did our weekly team meeting once a month in another place in people were doing their activities, and we could also then introduce the Konsthall and its activities to the people who hosted us, Art Center, for their team meeting. Another thing that we did, and this is important as a background to Tensta Museum, is that we immediately got rid of VIP openings. Instead, we started with local lunches the day of the opening from Tensta, with whom we had worked or had other types of relationships with, for a lunch with the artists, so that the locals would be the first ones to experience the new project. The lunch always included an introduction to the new exhibition or project, and in the evening, the general audience was welcomed. So back to Tensta Museum, reports from New Sweden. It looked at history and memory in the neighborhood from the point of view of the location, the people living there, and people working there. It was an eclectic project with artworks, old and new commissions, archival material from civil society as well as official archives, research projects with architects, cultural geographers, local associations, musicians, and many more. So it can be described as a big quilt with numerous different patches of fabric, different colors, textures, etc. And the first installment of Tensta Museum looked like this. We called it the fall department, playing with the notion of the museum. Not only did this small and fragile art center take on the role of the museum in order to be able to talk about things that museums typically talk about, i.e. history, we also toyed with how museums are usually working. So instead of a museum having departments according to material or periods in terms of longer stretches of time, for instance, the Middle Ages or the Enlightenment, etc. But we divided it along the lines of the seasons of the year. So this was the fall department. Seen from a different perspective to give you a sense of the variety of types of projects. And importantly, there were a number of artworks dealing with late modernist housing in different parts of the world. Not only is late modernist housing a global phenomenon, you can find it basically all over the planet. It is also something that artists in many different places have been engaging with. And what is important here is that when artists have dealt with late modernist housing, it is often more complex than, for instance, when you read about such areas or hear about it in the media, which tends to simplify, to polarize, and to describe them as dangerous, as ugly, as monotonous, etc. On the contrary, many of the artists look at the complex histories, also aesthetic dimensions of the architecture, and in fact that it is also a type of architecture where extremely interesting architects have been engaged. So the fall department was dense with projects, art projects and others, but also events. So there were numerous seminars, lectures, walks, etc. And this just gives you an impression of the amount of contributors to the fall. What's interesting, Tensta is not only the place of the old church, it's also old farmland. And we borrowed photographs from the local historical society, which is an amateur association that do things connected to local history. And they generously offered us to show some of their archival material, which they also suggested we should present in this way on this old type of poster stand. An architect living in Tensta who has done extensive research on the history of the late modernist housing estate, Erik Stenberg, lent us his private archive, which consists of photographs, maps, publications, documentary films, etc.
Artworks dealing with late modernist housing recurred during the entire period of Tensta Museum. Terence Gower's Tlatelolco is a project that looks at the giant estate in Mexico City, where an important student uprising took place in 1968 and where also the police clashed violently with the protesters. The question of housing was another recurring feature of the project. History and memory in the neighborhood was also reflected through political satirical drawings by Amin Amir, a Somali artist in exile in Canada, who regularly posts his images on social media and on his own website. And upon the suggestion of one of the inhabitants of Tensta with a background in Somalia, we decided to print out his pictures, displaying them on the wall of the exhibition and combining it with a series of seminars on the representation of Somalia in the public sphere in Sweden. It also included a documentary film about Amin Amir himself. Ahmet Ögüt's The Silent University became a red thread, and it is in fact a project that is still running at Tensta Konsthall in December 2022. The Silent University was started when he was invited by Tate Modern to do a new project. It's an independent educational platform that started in 2012 and which has happened in different cities across Europe, always in collaboration with a local organization and always in a different shape and form, reacting to the needs of that particular context. At Tensta Konsthall, the receptionist of the Konsthall, Fahima Al-Nabsi, who came to the neighborhood straight from Damascus in the early 90s, it became a language cafe. A language cafe for those who want to practice Swedish and Arabic with native Swedish volunteers, native Swedish speaking volunteers, as well as people who are native Arabic speakers. They began by meeting once a week, often in the exhibition space, Soon it became twice a week because of its popularity, and participants gathered from all parts of Stockholm. Once a month, the group made and still makes an excursion to another part of Stockholm in order to practice a different vocabulary, but also to learn to know the city together. Here they're visiting the Spånga Local Heritage Association. On this picture you can see the group visiting the parliament in the city center, taking part in a guided tour. So the fall department gave way to the spring department, and this slide indicates again the density of contributors and the variety of contributors from the neighborhood and far beyond. Here we can spot on the right-hand side material from the archive of one of the oldest associations in the area, namely the Kurdish Association. They've had a special focus on cultural programming, and we made a selection together with them from the archive specifically about their cultural activities. And like with Amin Amir, it was combined with a series of events, lectures about the history of Kurdistan, as well as poetry from the region. The same architect who lent us his private archive on the construction history and background of Tensta, Erik Stenberg, conducted numerous tours around the neighborhood, looking at both the landscape and the built environment. Stockholm is a segregated city with a city center that is, if I generalize, primarily white and wealthy, and a ring of suburbs that are colored and poor. In order to bridge this segregation, or at least create a movement between the different parts, the Tensta Museum team approached the Museum of the City of Stockholm, asking if they would be interested in a branch of Tensta Museum in their premises in the very city center. They agreed, and as a result, the artist Katarina Lundgren showed her commissioned project about artificial hills that are strewn across the city. They are built from rubble, often from the city center that was demolished in the 50s and 60s to give space for a modern downtown-looking city center. And another branch became part of the project, namely the library in Tensta, asking the Konsthall if they could open a small branch at the art center at Tensta Konsthall. They were going to be renovated and needed a place for a small branch, which we opened in the reception area of the Konsthall. So Tensta Museum reports from New Sweden indeed dealt with history, but it also looked at the contemporary situation of Tensta, and it wanted to project into the future. And in doing so, it was porous, and it was possible for people to propose things. Not that we asked for suggestions, but because we were so much in touch with the neighborhood through the project, they came to us with a number of different proposals. What you see on this slide is the first iteration of the classroom, and it came about simply because the local branch of the state-run school, Swedish for Migrants, which is offered to migrants who have gotten their papers. They wanted to come to the art center for their summer courses. They felt that a different environment would enhance learning. And we thought that this was a really interesting idea. We bought quickly furniture from IKEA and installed this makeshift classroom, which meant that the group of students could use it during weekdays during the summer. It also became the exhibition space for a series of original drawings by the planning architect of Tensta, Igor Dargalin. It was in fact a local inhabitant who knocked on our door, showing them, saying that he had worked at the city planning office, and one day he discovered a cardboard box in the corridor that was about to be thrown away, full of these drawings. He saved them and thought it could be a good idea to show them as part of Tensta Museum, which we also did for a number of months. This was the continuation of Tensta Museum. After the fall department and the spring department, it became Tensta Museum Continues. So for 5 more years, there was always something at Tensta Konsthall connected to Tensta Museum. It didn't take up the entire exhibition space as the fall and spring departments did, but there was something in some part of the art center connected to the project as such. In the first classroom, we also continued the strand of artists dealing with late modernist housing with Jakob Kolding's posters referring to the area in Copenhagen where he grew up. And here we can see the first group of students from the Swedish for Migrants course in the summer of 2014. Once we had a classroom, different groups approached us asking if they could use it, including Homework Assistance, which is an association that offers help to people who want extra support in terms of homework. For a number of years, they came once a week using the classroom. Another group that was a frequent user of the classroom was the news agency. A series of workshops or even a course for young people interested in telling other stories about the suburbs of Stockholm through journalism and art, with teachers and instructors and mentors from the University of Journalism, as well as a number of artists that were involved with Tensta Museum. I mentioned the green area next to the late modernist housing estate, the Järva field. Artist Ingela Irman created this giant papier-mâché sculpture of the plant called the giant hogweed, which grows a lot in the Järva field. This is a so-called invasive plant, which is described by many people in terms that are similar to those used for migrants from the anti-migrant movement or from the right and extreme right, as something invasive that needs to be stopped, etc. This also falls in line with the artist's particular interest in anything that is giant in nature, things that are considered beyond the normal. There were commissions as part of Tensta Museum, which in this case was Petra Bauer, the artist, and Sofia Wiberg, a sociologist, and Filippa Stålhane, an architect, together with the Women's Center in Tensta Hjulsta, an association gathering women in the neighborhood and having a small space which functions as an extended living room. They work together on rehearsals, a project on the politics of listening, for almost 1 year in the form of acts or exercises at the Konsthall with different participants. As part of rehearsals, they also designed a kind of classroom that could also be used for other activities. And after the exhibition period was over, the furniture went to the Women's Art Center. They could otherwise not afford any new furniture. Organically, this then developed into a new collaboration between Petra Bauer and the Women's Center. This time it's called Kök, K-Ö-K, Women Desire Collectivity, which is a sort of para-institution in relation to the Women's Center, looking precisely at women and collectivity. Another continuation of rehearsals is the Women's Cafe, women gathering at the Art Center twice a week to do handicraft together, textile handicraft, sometimes with instructors doing courses on weaving or embroidery, etc. And like with the Language Cafe, it also involves excursions to other parts of Stockholm, often connected to finding inspiration in terms of textile. The classroom idea led to a new artist designing it every year. Here we can see Christian Nyanpeta's version, and Tensta Museum here looked at what kind of art is present in Tensta 365 days per year. And we realized that the public schools in the neighborhood, like many public schools across Sweden, have really interesting artworks belonging to the municipality. So we did an inventory and borrowed 30 of those artworks that were on display in the classroom for 1 whole year in 2018 to celebrate the Art Center's 30th birthday. And the gaps that were created at the different schools were then filled with artworks by contemporary artists who had already been invited to Tensta Museum. In this case, Ylva Westerlund, who in fact is also a local inhabitant of Tensta. So Tensta Museum went beyond Tensta. Not only did it have a branch at the City Museum of Stockholm, it also had one at the Medieval Museum of Stockholm, and in 2018, for 6 months, it opened its summer and winter departments at Arctes, the State Architecture and Design Museum in the city center, where some of the same projects and artworks were shown as in Tensta, but also some new additions. Importantly, Tensta Museum was a project that played museum, where we pretended that we were a museum, taking on the authority that a museum typically has, despite the fact that the organizer was a small and very fragile art center, which never knows from year to year what the budget will be, where there is no safety and security in terms of continuation. It played museum also in the sense that it doesn't have a collection that a museum would usually have, But thinking more about it, it became clear that Tensta itself functioned as the collection of Tensta Museum, or possibly also as the archive of Tensta Museum. And while it looked back at history and memory, it also talked about the contemporary situation, the new Sweden, a Sweden where the social welfare state has been eroded, and the image that is known abroad is appearing not to fit with the reality any longer. It simultaneously functioned as a window to the future, a society where more parts will look more like Tensta than maybe the inner city of Stockholm. Thank you very much.